Hey guys, this is Eric Weingart with Weingart Racing. Today's video is a really exciting one, especially if you're into LSs. This one is comparing the horsepower numbers, because I dynoed both these sets of heads on my LS dyno mule, and what we're going to see is the horsepower difference between a ported Cathedral stock 243 head, so it's a 243 head that I ported, and I'm going to share all those specs with you, the full numbers, all of that obviously, compared to a stock AFR LS3 Enforcer head. So this, don't confuse this with their Mongoose one that's CNC ported. This is their cheaper one. It's the Enforcer line. So I know some of you are like, man, I really would wish you'd had like a stock 823 instead of this AFR Enforcer head. Well, you can go back and watch a previous video because I actually did a comparison on the dyno between this AFR LS3 Enforcer head and the stock 823 heads. It's only about a 10 horsepower difference, but go watch that. It's pretty neat. So what I'm going to show you today is the horsepower difference between the two, because this one was a little bit of a shocker, okay? So just to give you a rundown of the engine before you start typing in the comments. What this engine is, it's an iron block 6 liter, but it's not a 6 liter engine. It's a 408, so it's a stroked LS engine. It's got a 4030 bore, 4-inch stroke. Scat rods and crank, it's got icon pistons, and the camshaft that was used for both of these is a hydraulic roller from Texas Speed. It's their stage 2 camshaft, which is like 229 duration on intake and 240 something on exhaust. 629 lift on intake and 606 on exhaust. 112 lobe separation. And that was used on both of these. As far as compression ratios, that part gets a little different because the chamber size on these, and I measured both of them. I actually physically measured. I just didn't trust what it said from AFR's website as far as chamber size. I actually CC'd the intake runner, chambers, and exhaust. But compression changes because this one is a 64 cc chamber about, and I'll show you the exact one in a minute. And this is about a 69 to 70. I think it's actually 70. But I'll show all those numbers in there. So the compression ratio did change between the two, which that part's like, yeah, but I'm not going to mill. Eventually, by the way, this head, this AFR LS3 head, is going to get ported, and we're going to retest it on the dyno as well. And then we're going to mill it down to get its compression ratio up a bit. And then we can go back and look at how it compared to this one. But there's no doubt between the two, looking at them, you're definitely going to have a compression ratio difference. But in all fairness, if you were getting an 823 head, which is the LS3 head, you're going to have a compression ratio difference between the two heads anyway, because the 243 has a smaller chamber. So anyway, I done a full port job on this one, no port work on that. As far as intake manifold, should have done that one too. Both of them have a Victor Junior manifold. So this is a carbureted setup. I didn't use EFI. And the reason for that is, one, the dyno's not set up for it yet. And two, it's much easier. So it's much simpler to have that way. So both of them ran a Victor Junior intake manifold. One obviously was for a Cathedral, one was for a rectangular port. Both had a 1000 CFM 4150 carburetor, but I did test the Dominator on both of them as well, but we'll get to that later in the video anyway. So that's it. They're 1 3/4 headers. I don't think anybody's actually asked that, but it's 1 3/4 headers. It's actually a chassis header and just barely clears the dyno, which some of you don't understand that. The dyno has a water brake in the back, and that's how it operates. But it's kind of wider than we'd have maybe in a chassis car somewhat, and especially in some of the spots. And some of the dyno header or chassis headers themselves, they scoot really tight in, and they can make contact with either the bell housing or the dyno itself. So these ones just barely clear, but they actually are for a chassis. But anyway, enough of me rambling. Let me just go ahead and show you the dyno results, and then we can talk about the specs on the head so you can kind of make your own guesses why they did what it did. So let's just get to the results. Before I get to these dyno results, if you would like to have a copy texted to you, I'm putting a link in the description to this video so that you can go to my online store and you could pay to have those texted to you. I'll warn you, if it's an Android phone, it's probably gonna come a little blurry. It's much better if you do an iPhone. You might say, well, crap, man, I really wanna see that. I really would like to see it. I'm also putting a link in the description to buy the LS Dyno Mule book. And what's gonna happen is, after I get done testing all 6 sets of cylinder heads, in case you're wondering, that would be the stock 823 heads already tested, the AFR LS3 heads already tested, the ported 243 heads already tested, ProMax small bore LS3 heads already tested, Brodix BR3 heads mildly ported, the ProMax large bore LS3 heads, and these AFR Enforcer LS3 heads, once I get done porting them, will also be tested. There's also, right now, 3 camshafts have been tested. There's going to be more tested too. So once that's all wrapped up, which I imagine it's probably going to be around October, I would imagine, all that testing will be done. That will all be into a print book where you'll see these actual sheets. And I have got it a pre-order right now, and the link's in there. So order now, because I'm only going to make 10 more books than I have for orders, because it costs so much to make the books anyway. But if you would like all that information just in one point, instead of watching through, I don't know, 20 videos, do that. Or I could just text you these information for at least this current last dyno session. You'll get all those. So anyway, enough of that. Let's get to it. This one you might have seen from the last video. This one right here is the AFR Enforcer LS3 head. So that's this head, completely stock. I will tell you through this whole entire thing, ignore this air-fuel ratio, because right away it looks really rich. And some people have commented, why does it always look like your chambers are so black? You should really lean this thing out. This air-fuel ratio that comes here is calculated because it looks like that. You would think it looks like that. But the thing is, there's something going on with the air turbine. I think it's getting stuck or something. And the fuel turbine, the way it works is the computer says, this is the amount of air that goes through, this is the amount of fuel, this is your calculator, sorry. This amount of air, this amount of fuel, that's your calculated air-fuel ratio. But that's not what the O2 sensor is reading, because I'm watching the O2 sensor, and it varies. So on an LS engine, this is weird. It goes really lean when you start a pull. And then it gets really lean, like almost normal in the middle, then really rich towards the end. This isn't tracking that at all. It's just not correct. So what I'm trying to say is you can ignore this. Did you play with jetting and stuff? On some I did. And did you play with timing? Yes, for sure I did. So these what I'm showing you are the best. So this is the AFR LS3. If you look, it made this Texas Speed camshaft, 641 horsepower. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry I'm jumping back and forth. The other reason why that these chambers look black, because you might be saying, man, that sure doesn't look right, is this. When we're doing a dyno pull, I shouldn't say dyno pull, when we're doing the dynoing, we're gonna get the engine up to temperature because we want the water and oil temperature to be the same when we test in different heads. It doesn't sound like that big a deal, but if you cool the water, so if you have a cooler water on this head versus this head, that one will make more power because of the cooler water running through it as opposed to that. So it's not a fair comparison. The other one, and this is much harder to do, is oil temperature. So we measure oil temperature too, because another weird thing, if you get the oil temperature, if you have the water temperature cold and the oil temperature cold, it actually makes less power because it takes more power to turn the oil pump to pump the oil. So what we're trying to get to, and it takes a while for us to get to the right temperatures because we actually have to put a mild load on the engine, get it warmed up to hopefully put some heat in the oil, turn it off, let it heat soak for a while to try to get to that oil temperature where we want, so we can get the water temperature where we want, so we can compare them. It takes time, and a lot of that time's in the idle and also the transition circuit. And I can tell you, we're not tuning those on my carburetor. There's no sense, and part of that causes this. So we're running pump gas too, so it's a 91 octane with just a splash of 110. Clearly not enough, otherwise it'd be a lot cleaner. But pump gas is dirty for one, but also in that intermediate circuit, it's not ideally tuned, and I'm not messing with it. We're just dynoing. So sorry for a little getting off tangent, but that's part of what causes some of the carbon buildup. A lot of the time, it's not at full wide open throttle. At wide open throttle, the air-fuel ratio is looking pretty good, not in between when we're trying to get it to the temperatures we want, and that's really what's creating more of this. Now back to their stuff. So the AFR LS3's made 641 horsepower, which is pretty good, and 56 foot-pounds of torque, also really good. This one right here, because of these heads and they have the larger chamber, that's 11.1 compression ratio, okay? Now, let's see how these, I probably should have pointed out, I ported these these 243 heads for a customer. I'm really happy with them. It's probably one of the nicest ones I've done. They're cut out to a 202 intake valve. They have a 64.5 cc chamber, which yields it 11.8 compression ratio. I will show you the flow numbers and all that later. But they are ported by me, and which is weird because of all these dyno tests I've done so far, small block, big block, none have had any of my fully ported heads on it by hand until now. So anyway, let's look at its numbers. turn the page. This is with the 4150 carburetor. If we look, it made 618.5 horsepower, so, which isn't bad, and I did it at 6,500. Here's what's interesting. 6,500 RPM, let's see where it peaked over here on the LS3. You guessed it, 6,600 RPM. It's only 100 RPM more, which I'll show an overlay in a minute. If you look at the torque though, 559.2, so it was actually up over this AFR Enforcer. Now, once I give you all the information about the heads, you're gonna have more of a head scratcher, but really good. But this doesn't really kind of show the picture, the overlay does. So let me show you that. Here we go. This red line is the 243s ported. The black line is the AFR Enforcers. If you look, and we're starting to pull about 3,600 RPM, the ported 243, and don't get me wrong, the compression's helping it because it is up probably about half a point, or well, more than half a point. But that's huge. It made more peak torque and really, really good. It wasn't really, the 243 was beating it up until about 5,300 RPM. At that point, they start diverging, and you can see the difference. Now, this was with a 4150 carburetor, but I am amazed at how close they are, because when I show you the flow numbers, they're not close. But yeah, quite amazed. But dig this. This power curve you see here for the 243s was not the best power it made. This was the best power it made on a 4150 carburetor. The AFR LS3 heads, that's the best power it made, period, which was also on a 4150 carburetor. I'm confused. This is the same carburetor, same intake, spacer, everything combination. But the 243s did a lot better when the Dominator got on. It did this. This is just a 243 head, but this is with the red line is with a Dominator on it. So it's got an HVH tapered adapter that I love and has worked on almost everything. And this black line is with the 4150. If you notice, that Dominator on this LS has done just like on these 243 heads, has done just like it has on every other engine I put it on and head combination, with the exception of the LS3 rectangular port heads. That's the only time it does not work. But if you look how much it brought up torque. We're now at 565. And this is with the 243 heads, and horsepower went to 626. So if we kind of go back, and I didn't do a great job of printing off the two differences because this was direct A-B comparison, same carburetor, everything. This is the 243 with the Dominator, which if I'd done that, and I could have done a printout of it, but I'll go ahead and tell you, when I put the Dominator setup on the 243 heads, it lost power. It did not make, it only made more power at the very lower RPMs from 36 to about 4,000. After that, it was a loss. And there's only been 3 times that's ever happened, and on every single time it's on a rectangular port LS3 head. It's not been on the Cathedral. So that's a weird head scratcher in itself, but I didn't put this comparison on because it looks really, really good on to compare to the AFR Enforcers when it's best. Because I should have said the best on the Enforcers, the best on the 243s, but if you look, now it's 627, 631's all it made with the Enforcers at best. You're down. That's right. Hardly any horsepower, maybe 5. But look at the torque difference. So 559. This was, of course, this one was, let's go back to a cheat, but I think this was 555 peak or something. I can't even remember. I think it is 5, maybe 556, remember. But this one's 565. Now, don't get me wrong, compression probably makes up for some of that. But that's a little bit of an interesting finding when you think about it. Those heads are far closer when you have them peaked out. And I know that sounds strange because you're like, well, why didn't you put a Dominator? I did. It lost power. I tried. Trust me, I tried. There's only been 3 situations I ever lost power, and that was one of them. But yeah, those are much, much closer. But let me show you some of the data on the head, so because I know some of you just care about this stuff. Let me show you some of the flow numbers and other data, actual like the volume of the head and things like that, so that you can kind of get a better idea for those that are into the information junkies. But at least there you got your dyno numbers. They're close. Very, very close. And I'll be honest, if you were driving on the street, I would take that one. I hate to say it. Because if you look at the design, this should be so much better. Port the 243s, and don't get me wrong, when I got done, because this is for a customer, this set of heads was expensive. He paid me, because I charge quite a bit to port, not like a ton, but well, I guess relative. But he also put in bigger valves and stuff. That was more expensive than that. But this one was, if you were driving on the strip, it'll kill it. It just will. Yeah, I know you're like, well, no, because you get like here, it's there. Yeah, put the Dominator on. And it ain't even close. So anyway, let me show you the data for the heads now. Okay, I'll start with the specs on the AFR LS3 head first. It's a 208 1600. I know stock LS3 heads are 2.165. That's not what AFR chose for this. It's a 208 1600. 70.2 cc combustion chamber, and the volume of the port when I measured was 238.4 cc's. You need to remember that number. Okay, this ported 243, I opened it up to a 202 intake valve. It has a 1550 exhaust valve. This has a volume, so the volume when I cc'd it is 238.4 cc's. That's right. That head right here, the 243, and the AFR LS3 head have the exact same volume to the 10th, which is weird. I didn't plan it that way, no. Which you're like, oh my gosh, that's too big. Because if I said I have a Cathedral head that's 238 cc's, most of you would be like, it's too big. You just saw the dyno results. Was it? It didn't look like that way down low. But anyway, also a 202 intake valve, 1600. Now here's what's interesting. Those are just cc's, and you really can't compare them that way. Why? Because the center line distance is different. In other words, because this is an LS3 head and the port's raised up, it has a longer distance that the actual port is before it gets to the valve, as compared to the Cathedral one. So it's not a big difference, but it is some, and I'll show you that measurement in a second. Just to give you, I'll just tell you. This one's, my numbers are where I'm looking. Yeah. The 243, it's CSA, or it's not CSA, its length is 5.43 inches long, as I measured it. This one on the AFR Enforcer is 5.5. So there's a 7/100ths of an inch difference for you guys. So there's some of your specs. 64.5 cc chamber, 70.2. To the flow numbers. This right here this is from the Science bench. I flowed them on both benches. This is Science Digital 680. I also have a Superflow 750. This is from the Science. And I'm putting the 243 right next to it. So this is the 243s. This is the AFRs. If you look, it's obvious. They're close at one, not that it matters. 143 on the 240, or 144 on the 243s to 156. You could tell 227 to 203, 273 at 4 on the AFR Enforcers, 246. These flow so much less. And by the way, this is a really good set of heads that I did. Gotta pat myself on the back, because this is probably one of the better ones I've done. At 600, it goes 300 on the 243s, compared to at 600, it goes 329. So if you just base it off of strictly flow numbers, like this one's gonna be the dominating factor. Remember, it only peaked 100 RPM later. So yeah, this is where it gets interesting though. Mine doesn't back up as much. So I lost 15 CFM at the backup. This one lost quite a bit more. Peak, which you know, some of you are like, you don't care, it doesn't matter. It does matter, evidently. 309 to a 314. So the exhaust side, that part's different. That's where I'm better. So not there at 1, but I'm better at 2, 108 to 105 than the Enforcer, 154 to a 140 on the Enforcer, 198 to a 171 on the Enforcer, and I'll just go up to peak, 234 to a 215. So I outflowed on the exhaust side. It outflows me on the intake side. Remember, I'm still a smaller exhaust valve, period, 155 to 1600. Larger intake valve, which, I forgot to bring this up. When I was bringing up the small block Chevy versus the LS engine, several people said, well, the reason why the small block Chevy had better was because it had a bigger bore and helps the heads flow more. That's somewhat true, but not entirely. The biggest thing that has an influence is where is the valve in the bore. So on a 243 head, it's in a stock location, which is pretty close to the actual chamber, which you can kind of see. AFR moved the valve. So if you look, it moved it over. They do this on their LS3 Mongoose heads even more. But that valve is moved over towards the center, away from the bore. So when you do those comparisons, don't assume just because of the bore size that it actually flows more. It's the valve relationship. So if you take a small block Chevy, for instance, it's actually closer to the bore on a 4155 bore than an LS3 head is, well, this AFR LS3 head, because it moved it off. So you really can't use that. That's what I'm trying to get at. Anyway, back to some more of the numbers here. There's your chambers. This is the 243, 64.5. Intake was 238.4. Exhaust was 84 or 83 cc's. Oddly enough, this is from the AFR Enforcer over here. So let me just move some stuff around. If we look at the AFR Enforcer, it had a 238 cc, 0.4 cc runner. Like I said, the same. Exhaust was actually bigger, 92, compared to this one was only 83. It's a little bit longer too, though. Chamber 70.2 cc's compared to 64.5. And then we get our links and measurements. Now here's what's interesting. This is the AFR Enforcer, the bigger one, obviously. Its minimum area at the pinch is 2.9. On the Cathedral head, it is 2.5, I want to say. Yeah, 2.57. Because that's where it's narrowest at. It's right through here in the beginning. So it actually has a minimum cross section that's pretty small, and then it gets much larger as you go through. This one's still got more there. So you would think that this one should be dominating. Don't get me wrong about compression, but still. Anyway, very interesting to say the least, but I want to show you one more thing that you probably don't even care about. By the way, I did weigh the valves. This is actually, I took velocity measurements from inside the port over the short side. This is just for fun. Most of you guys don't even care, but that's feet per second. I didn't do that on the 243s because I hadn't really planned to test them. And then I did, and I was like, oh crap, I'm not gonna redo it though. Anyway, one more thing I'm gonna show you is the swirl numbers. So right here, this is actually the flow numbers from the Superflow. The Superflow bench reads higher, just gonna let you know. And this one is from the AFR Enforcer head. And according to the Superflow, it flows 325 on intake, and that does it at about 600 lift. But the number you want to pay attention to, this is the swirl, right there. It actually has quite a bit of swirl for an LS3 head. Usually LS3 heads have no swirl, or usually LS heads in general have no swirl. This still cannot compare to like a small block Chevy. A small block start about 1,000 RPM and then just keep ramping up. But if you notice, it's about 400, 800, 600, 800. I mean, it's okay, right? So, interesting. But let me show you the one for the, I'm gonna go back. File, a little bit from history. I'm gonna show you that 243. You might say, why didn't you print this out? Well, my printer's out of ink. That's why. So we're gonna go report, make a report. There we go. So this is the 243. Look how much better it flows on this one. Let me get my mouse together. Look, it did 319 at 1 inch. And it was doing 252 at 4, so it's better. See how much better it flows on the Superflow? Kind of cheats up the numbers. Swirl numbers. Look at that. It had no swirl there at 400. None. The air's just moving down. There's no really swirl happening in the middle. But then once it does start, it's a little bit faster, but it has nothing there. Just an interesting thought. Anyway, a little bit longer of a video because I gave you so much information. Guys, thanks for watching. These AFR Enforcer heads will be getting some port work done, and we'll get to retest them. Try to buy the results. You'll find them interesting. There's none of my opinion stuff in there. It's strictly numbers. Do what you want with them. And remember, I'm no Superman. I make plenty of mistakes. So if there's a mistake I said in this video, go ahead and put it in the comments. As long as you're not too harsh, you get to stick around. But yeah, I definitely make mistakes. And if there's something you want to see tested, I can't, that I can do easily, I do it. Especially if you have an AFR, or sorry, especially if you have an intake manifold for an LS3. Because I've only tested 2 because I only got 2. Those are like the easiest thing to test. I would love to change and see what could happen. Will these 243s be going back on the dyno? The answer is no. I know some people want to see more tests done with those. They're not. So I'm going to clean them back up and get them to the customer. Put my stamp of approval on it because you gotta admit, that's pretty good power, especially from a stock Cathedral head. So I don't know, it's pretty good. pretty good. So anyway, especially with a so much smaller valve too. But guys, take care. Thanks for watching. Remember, I'm no Superman. I don't port cast iron heads. You guys take care.